A reading from the Gospel according to Mark, the 9th chapter. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching the disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what Jesus was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when Jesus was in the house, he asked the disciples, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. Jesus sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then Jesus took a little child and put it among them. And taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The word of God for the people of God.
Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37 is the assigned gospel reading for today. It shows up in the lectionary every September, every 3 years. And it's also the appointed gospel text once every 3 years during Lent. When I looked at my Excel spreadsheet of sermons, yes, I have such a thing, I discovered that I have preached on this text 6 times. So this is my 7th sermon on Mark 9, 30 through 37. What more is there to say that I haven't already said? What else can I possibly come up with that is worth anything? After my little pity party about having to preach on this text for the 7th time, after I got over my resistant grouchiness, I asked myself 2 questions. What is this text demanding of me for the very first time? And what is this text demanding of all of us together at this cultural moment? Let's start by reminding ourselves of what happens in these verses. Jesus and the disciples, they're traveling together, and he wants to say, under the radar, quiet, private, secretive even. Jesus tells the disciples that he is going to be betrayed, killed, and will rise. The disciples, they don't understand, and they're afraid to ask questions. They argue about who's the greatest. Jesus tells them that the first must be last and servant of all. And then Jesus takes a child who suddenly appears out of nowhere and holds that child in his arms and says, "Whoever welcomes a child welcomes me, and therefore welcomes God." That's a lot going on in 2 paragraphs. So I turn to scholars for help. Amy Oden is a professor of history of Christianity at Wesleyan Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. She wrote a commentary on these verses from Mark, and she asks a marvelous unspoken question of this text, and here it is. If the disciples are so confused and scared, why don't they simply ask Jesus for help? Why don't they ask for some help? He's right there. They're private. No one's watching. Professor Oden says this: the disciples probably do not ask for help because they don't want to appear as confused as they are. Or their distress at his teaching is so deep they fear addressing it. Besides, the closer we are to Jesus, the more we're supposed to know about God, about prayer, about the Bible, about the religious stuff, right? She continues, in our own time, no one wants to look uninformed, confused, or clueless. We withhold our toughest questions often within our own churches. We pretend we do not have hard questions. We don't want to be exposed as being an imposter. We don't want to be judged by what we don't know or don't understand. Yet, she says, the deepest mysteries of life do indeed elude us. Verse 34 reveals what happens to the disciples when they sidestep the real question they're afraid to ask. They turn to arguing with each other, squabbling among themselves over petty issues of rank and status. The words of Professor Amy Oden. When engaging with a biblical text like this one, it can be helpful to wonder, where am I in this story? With whom do I identify or feel a kinship? Given that the disciples are confused, afraid, distressed, full of ego, and arguing amongst themselves, chances are good we would not jump at the chance to be identified with them. Wouldn't we rather be like the child, the one who gets scooped up into the arms of Jesus? What childlike part of you needs to be scooped up, comforted, reassured, tenderly cared for these days? And is there a child in your life, perhaps a grandchild, niece, a nephew, a godchild, your own child, who needs to be scooped up with loving kindness? Are you willing to be that person? Are you able to be that person, if even for a short time? Wouldn't we rather be like Jesus in this story, so confident in his own skin, so dedicated as a teacher, so clear about who he is, even as he anticipates being betrayed and executed? So when do you feel most clear about who you are? What you're called to be? Do you give thanks to God for your strengths, your abilities, the ways in which you are most alive as the person God created you to be? Yes, being like the child, being like Jesus, those feel good. More often than not, however, we are like the disciples, comparing ourselves to find out how do we measure up. Unwilling to admit that we do not have all the answers, scared of what we do not understand. In fact, we are not simply like the disciples, we are disciples. We are followers of Jesus. So let's get real about the three things that this text reveals about Christian discipleship. And here they are. 1, being a follower of Jesus means that at times you will be confused. 2, being a follower of Jesus means that at times you will feel afraid. And 3, being a follower of Jesus means that at times you will get sidetracked by your ego and be loath to admit it. Not just you, me too. Me too. I'm a follower of Jesus, and believe me, there was plenty of confusion during my 4 years of seminary education. There was instability and wrestling and grappling, as well as certainty and clarity, focus and resolve. Confusion often means that we are in the process of growing. There's confusion during spiritual growth, intellectual growth, physical growth too. As a follower of Jesus, there was fear while I was at home in Minneapolis with Noah and Truman during the riots after George Floyd was killed. We lived just blocks from the burning 3rd Precinct building on Lake Street, just blocks from the National Guard in our city carrying their weapons. I was afraid. And as a follower of Jesus, there is ego when I get around my clergy colleagues. I am loath to admit it, friends, but it's true. I feel better than some of them, and I feel inadequate compared to others. Believe me, I know it's so unbecoming, it's so petty, it's so unnecessary, but still, if I am honest, I have to admit that sometimes I compare myself to my professional peers. As this morning's text makes clear, this kind of comparison is the antithesis of the way of Jesus. In fact, my older son Noah has a fabulous retort when he hears anyone comparing themselves to others in a disparaging way. He proclaims, "Comparison is the thief of joy." I don't know where he came up with it. But of course, in high school, all you're doing is comparing yourselves to others, right, as a high school student. And he proclaims, even at home, "Comparison is the thief of joy, Mom, so stop it." Okay. So are you bragging about yourself, feeling like you are superior to others? Comparison is the thief of joy. Conversely, are you cutting yourself down, feeling like you do not measure up? Comparison is the thief of joy. So either way, inflated ego, deflated ego, comparison is the thief of joy, because joy comes when we are honest with ourselves and others, because joy comes when there is equity, justice, and parity among God's people. That brings me to the writing of Richard Rohr. I get the daily devotional every week. It just pops in my inbox. And the devotional from Tuesday, Rohr writes this: "The gospel is not about being nice. It's about being honest and just." Simple, straightforward, clear. The gospel is not about being nice. It's about being honest and just. Rohr goes on to say, quote, "Our job is to learn how to be honest with love and respect. Once we are freed from our narcissism that thinks we are the center of the world, or that our rights and dignity must be defended before other people's rights and dignity, we can finally live and act with honesty and justice." The way of Jesus is about being honest and just. The flip side, putting it another way, the way of Jesus is about refusing dishonesty and upending injustice. That, friends, is our lifelong work, and it takes effort. There's evidence all around us, here in the U.S. and abroad. Every day in the news headlines, we see that dishonesty and injustice produce chaos, violence, suffering. We may get punished for being honest. Think of all the corporate whistleblowers, the rape survivors, the college protesters who tell the truth. They get punished sometimes. We may get refused for pursuing justice. Think of the union workers on strike, the climate activists, the people in the Black Lives Matter movement. They may get refused for pursuing justice. So yes, we may get punished for being honest. We may get refused for pursuing justice. We need to do it anyway. Jesus did it anyway. Jesus came to serve, not to be served. Today's reading is a Jesus bundle about servanthood. Ah, dear church, the good news is that Jesus takes us into his arms. He takes us into his arms when we understand and when we do not understand, when we are afraid and when we are not afraid, when we are full of ego and when we are free from ego. Jesus embraces the child in us all in order to help us grow into a servant of all.